The name of this parak is Mitzvahs Chalitza, and it begins on Kuf Aleph. I'll read to you the relevant psukim in the Torah by way of introduction. We're in Parshas Ki Tetzei, and we're in Parak Chaf Hey of Sefer Dvarim. And this section of the Torah, which begins in Pasuk Hey, presents the mitzvah of Yibum. So you have two brothers, one of which dies after he's married, but he has no children. And his wife, his almana, falls for Yibum to his brother. So you have Reuven and Shimon, two brothers, and Reuven's married to Rachel. Reuven dies without any children. Shimon now has a mitzvah of Yibum to be miyabim to marry Rachel. Shimon has another option, and that's called Chalitza. And that begins in Pasuk Zayin. And that's going to be the subject of our study. The Pasuk says, V'im lo yachpota ish lakachas es yivimto. He's not interested in being Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. Also, Yevimto Ashara El Hazkenim. And she, her name is Yevama. He's the Yavam, she's the Yevama, right? So the Yevama goes to the Shar, to the gateway, where the Zkenim are sitting. And throughout the Torah, especially in Sefer Dvarim, the Shar of the city is where the court is located. There's a mitzvah to establish a court in every city in Israel. And that's at the Shar of the Ir, the gateway to the city. The Amra, and she declares, Me'ein Yevami lahakim li'achiv shem b'Yisrael lo avayabmi. This Yavam refuses to marry me in order to have a child that will be called on the name of his late brother, my late husband. And V'karolo zikne iro v'dibrei he, the Yavam, stands in front of his Kenim. They interrogate him, and they ask him, what's the deal? V'omad v'omar lo chafatzi l'kachta. He refuses to marry her. And now we get to the actual Chalitza, which is the subject of our chapter in Masechet Yevamot. So we have the Zkenim, and we have the Yevama, and we have the Yavam. The stage is set. And V'cholza na'alo me'al raglo. She removes his shoe from his leg. And notice that we're talking about a na'al and one na'al. She's not going to remove two shoes, but one. And it's me'al raglo. And obviously, it's on one leg. We'll see that it's going to be the right leg. V'yarka b'fanav, and she spits in front of him. V'onsa v'yamra, and she declares, Kacha ye'asa le'isha shelo yivna es beis achiv. And this is what should be done to someone who refuses to build a house on the name of his late brother who died without children. And this parsha ends with the words in Pasuk Yud, V'nikra shmo b'Yisrael beis chalutza na'al. Very ambiguous pasuk. Now, what's the halachic purpose of chalitza? So in order to understand the purpose of chalitza, we have to go back to a concept called zika. Zayin Yud Kuf Hey. And that means a bond. It means ishus, a kind of relationship of a marriage relationship. It's not a full-fledged marriage relationship, but it's close to a full-fledged marriage relationship between the Yavam and the Yevama. It's almost as if the marriage to the late brother is now branched off. It now extends to the live brother. And there could be many brothers. So she has a zika to all the brothers, a kind of marriage relationship. One of the brothers will either perform yibum or chalita. Perhaps will turn to the oldest of the brothers. Again, it could be the oldest brother's dead, but the next in line. And there will be chalitza. In essence, two very important comments about chalitza. Number one, the purpose of chalitza is to break the zika. Just like in a marriage relationship, a get delivered by the husband to his wife will break the ishus, such that now she can marry anyone else. She can't marry a Kohen. In a parallel mirror image, chalitza will allow her, permit her to marry anyone else, except for a Kohen. The second point that I wanted to make is that there's a very great difference between a get and chalitza in the sense that a get is initiated by the Baal, but in the case of chalitza, she's the active participant in two ways, in three ways, actually. Number one, she's the one who removes his shoe. We'll see what the word shoe means in this context. Number two, she's the one who spits in front of him. And number three, she's the one who makes the declaration that lo ava yevamot lahakim shem liach. So in that sense, chalitza stands in contrast with get, because in get, she's basically passive. And in chalitza, he's basically passive. Once she gets chalitza from one brother, then she can marry anyone else. She doesn't have to get chalitza from any of the other brothers. Why? Because the chalitza removes the zika that binds her to this entire family of brothers. Could be one brother, could be a million brothers. It doesn't matter. Now, our Mishnah here on Daf Kuf Aleph opens with two words, mitzvahs chalitza. Now, I just want to say a few words about the word mitzvah in this context. It's not so simple. I wouldn't call chalitza mitzvah. There's another word that I would use, and that's a matir. Matir means it's a procedure, a ritual, an action, whatever you want to call it, that permits her to marry anyone else because it removes the zika. That doesn't make it a mitzvah per se. On the contrary, yibum is the mitzvah. And if all things are equal, the Torah advocates in favor of yibum. Lahakim shem liachim hames. But the Torah gave an alternative, in a sense, a fallback position, in event that the Yavam is not interested in being Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum, because we don't want to leave this woman in a state where she can't marry anyone. She's zkuka, she has a zika to the Yavam, which doesn't allow her to marry anyone else. And the Yavam, from his part, is refusing to be miyabim. She's stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the Torah offered chalitza to allow her to marry to someone else, but to call it a mitzvah, I find that very odd. Maybe what the Mishnah means is that chalitza is not a mitzvah in the classic sense. It's a mitzvah in event that the real mitzvah, the first string mitzvah, namely yibum, is not an option. So instead of yibum, the Torah says, well, your obligation as a yavam, you can't just pack out. You have to give chalitza. Now, we'll see that in order for the yavam to be part of this chalitza, he's got to be bar mitzvah. He's got to be 13. The tragedy of Zikas Yibum is in a case where a man dies and he leaves behind him no children, but one brother who is 0 years old. I mean, he was just born 5 minutes before his older brother died. We cannot allow this woman, the Yevamot, to get married until, at the earliest, this boy is 13 years old. She might be stuck for 13 years. That's the tragedy of Yibum. And no one, not the Rashka Bahag, could change that. That's written in stone. That is the right. So these are biblical laws of Zikas Yibum. There's another kind of tragedy. If, let's say, the dead brother leaves a live brother who's somewhere out in Noahsville, for example, during the Soviet Union, this happened very often, and there's no way we can get him over here for chalitza. No shlichus will operate for chalitza. It's got to be the yavam himself. Or alternatively, imagine a situation of a yavam who refuses to show up in a bezdin. And we don't have the wherewithal today to force him to show up. But again, leaving aside those tragic scenarios, if all is equal, the yavam will participate in chalitza. And the Mishnah says that mitzvahs chalitza b'shlosha dayanim. Right? We saw that the pasuk says we also el shar, and the shar we said where the zkenim sit is the bezdin, and the bezdin is made up of how many dayanim? So the Mishnah at the beginning of Sanhedrin classifies different cases that require different numbers of dayanim. The basic unit of a bezdin is a minimum of 3 dayanim. Then we have a larger court, which is called the Sanhedrin Akatana, made up of 23 judges. Then we have a largest court, which is made up of 71 judges. That's the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin Agdol. For the purpose of Yibum, I shouldn't say Yibum, sorry, I should say Chalitza. All we need is the basic unit of a bezdin, and that's made up of 3 dayanim. We're going to learn as we go along that it's not really a valid bezdin because these 3 people do not have to have smicha, and they don't have to be dayanim. They could be just people, ordinary people off the street. And we're going to learn later that we add extra numbers of people to join in this tribunal, and we beef it up to 5 or 10. I don't know if anyone here on this Zoom shir has ever seen chalitza. I saw chalitza twice. It's much more emotional than a get. Usually in the case of a get, it's like, break out a bottle of schnapps and celebrate, because very often a get is given after you wait so many months, and she's waiting for that get. The husband and wife have long decided to break up the marriage. In the case of chalitza, it's much more emotional because the background to the mitzvah of chalitza is the death of the brother without any children. And now the live brother is refusing to be miyabed. Again, I don't want to get into other issues in other prakim of Masechet Yevamot as to why today we no longer have the mitzvah of Yibum. But back in the day when the mitzvah of Yibum was alive, active, and well, chalitza meant that the yavam is packing out. He's not willing to participate in the great mitzvah of Yibum, and that's where chalitza comes in. But Baruch Hashem, we have chalitza, and even in our day we have chalitza. And it's very important to find the right na'al. Na'al, which loosely translates as a shoe, is really a halachic concept. And it breaks down into 2 categories. There's something called a minal, and there's something called a sandal. And in our context, a sandal is better than a minal, because a minal is made of soft leather, and although it fits the foot, but it's loose. In the case of a sandal, which is made of hard leather, it really tightens around the foot, and there's a grip of the foot on the sandal. So imagine if the sandal is too large for the foot of the Yavam. That's not good. It's got to be a good fit so that the sandal wraps around the bottom of the foot of the Yavam such that now she pulls it off in Chalitza. Cholza b'minal, however, if they didn't have access to a sandal, which is that hard leather, all they had was a minal, then chalitzosa kshera. It's a fallback position, a second-rate chalitza, but nevertheless, it's valid. And once again, this seems to indicate that chalitza is really a mitzvah, that I take the Mishnah literally. It's a mitzvah because we don't find lechatchila and b'di'evid, those categories don't apply to a matir. I mean, who cares? As long as she can get married and the chalitza is valid, why do you have to embellish the chalitza and do it this way, an ideal way? It fits and reflects more logically if there's a mitzvah. With regard to mitzvahs, we say lechatchila, you should do it this way, and b'di'evid is a fallback position. It's not the real mitzvah, but it's okay. You know, we'll give you some brownie points and get some credit and reward for it, but it's not really the ideal mitzvah. So you can have tzitzis that are b'di'evid kosher, they're called gardumim, and many of the tzitzis are ripped. You'd be surprised how in Hilchas tzitzis you can have a mitzvah tzitzis where you hardly see too many tzitzis. You know, you're supposed to see 8 tzitzis. So that's l'chatchila and b'di'evid. So again, the status of a minal is it's a shoe as far as chalitza, but it's not the ideal mitzvah. We want a sandal. A sandal, as we said, is made of hard leather and it wraps around the foot of the yavam in a very tight way. However, now the Mishnah lists cases where the chalitza is disqualified. It's meaningless. And that's the case of an anpilia. Now, Rashi tells me in Old French what is anpilia, and it's called kletzun. I don't know what the word kletzun means. If anyone here speaks French, but again, it's not probably the French that they speak today. But if you look it up in the translation in the back, which is called the Metargem, you'll see it's a sock, right? You have socks around your feet. So the man, the Yavam, has no shoes. He's only wearing socks. She pulls off his sock. Not good, not valid. It's not a chalitza. Chalitzasa psula. However, in the case of a sandal, the perfect sandal is a sandal sheyesh lo akev. Akev is the heel. And in this case, the sandal wraps around his heel. That's a perfect, ideal chalitza. However, she'ein lo akev, let's say you have a sandal, which under normal conditions is ideal for chalitza, but it has no akev. It means it doesn't cover his heel. It's open at the heel. In such a case, the Mishnah paskins psula. It will not be a valid chalitza. Now, the bottom of a shoe is usually called the sole of the shoe, but the sole could cover different parts of the feet, of the foot. In this case, we must have a sole that covers the heel. And if under the heel there's no sole, then the chalitza is possible. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is a little bit queasy. It's a little uncomfortable. and we're talking about an amputee. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a leg. But what he does have is the possibility of tying down a shoe to his stump, if you will. I don't know if that's the right word. And the question is, how much of his leg was removed? And how much of his natural leg does he still have? And the Mishnah says the following: Min kuva ulamata chalitzasa ksher. Arkuva is the knee. And the knee, if he has his natural leg up to the knee, the amputation was below the knee, that's considered a leg. And the shoe that is worn around the stump of his knee is considered a minal. And therefore, we attach that shoe to that part of his leg that's below the knee, and she can do chalitza, and it's a valid chalitza. But minar kuva lamala, if tragically his leg was amputated above the knee, then chalitzasa psula. It's not considered that he's got a nal that he's wearing on his leg. And hopefully in such a case, there is another brother who can perform chalitza who has a leg. Cholza besandal she'eno shalom. Now the Mishnah addresses the following question: does the shoe, the sandal, have to be his, private owned? Let's say he borrows it from someone else. In such a case, chalitza kshera. There is an ideal chalitza, which would be his now, his sandal. But b'di'eved, if it wasn't his sandal, we validate the chalitza. Now, we said that the sandal is made of leather. What about a wooden shoe? Like they used to, again, I'm dating myself when I was a child, they used to talk about the Dutch used to wear in Holland wooden shoes. Maybe they call them clogs, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, wooden shoes. And the Mishnah says, "Besandal shel eitz chalitzasa kshera." That's also a possibility. It doesn't have to be made of leather, it could be made of wood. Bishel smol biyamin. Chalitza requires taking off the shoe from his right foot. And that's in all cases. However, so if she takes off the shoe from his left foot, that's not chalitza. But what happens if he wears his left shoe on his right foot and she takes it off from his right foot? You might say that that's not really a minal because that minal was designated for his left foot. It's shaped to fit his left foot, curving that way, and now he's wearing it on his right foot. And the Mishnah tells me a pretty big chiddush that the chalitza's kshera, as long as she took the shoe off his right foot, even though it was his left shoe. And in all these cases, b'shel smol biyamin, chalitza kshera. And the chalitza is valid, even though it's a left shoe worn on the right foot. Also, begadol shu yachal laloch bo. Gadol means, in this context, that the shoe just doesn't fit. It's not like Cinderella. It's too large for his foot. However, even though it's too large for his foot, yachal lahalach bo. He can walk with that shoe. You know, it'll shake around a bit. It's very loose, but it won't fall off. He can still walk with it. That's the shear of a nal. So again, ideally it would be really fit to his foot and cover his foot, cling to his foot. It's got to cover his heel, as we discussed before. But b'di'eved, post facto, even if he wore a shoe that's not a good fit, in this case, we'll see a shoe that's too small, but in this case, the shoe is too large for his foot, but yachal lalachbo, he can schlep along and walk with it. It's kosher. Katan, what if it's too small for his foot? Shu chofa es rov raglo, at least it covers most of his foot. If it doesn't cover most of his foot, that's not a sandal. It could work for someone else who has a different foot, a smaller foot. But for this particular yavam, it's not valid. Why? Because it doesn't cover most of his foot. In all these cases where it covers most of his foot, where he can walk with the large shoe, where he's wearing his left shoe on his right foot, where he's wearing a sandal that's not his, a sandal that's made of wood rather than leather. In all those cases, chalitzaso shera, the chalitza is valid, and as a result, she can get married to anyone else. Now, if the shoe is either too small or too large, then it would seem that that chalitza is invalid. It's not recognized by the halacha. If it's so large that the oven can't walk in it, or if it doesn't, it's too small to cover most of its foot, chalitzasa psula, and it would be invalid. Mara asks the following question: with regard to chalitza, we need a tribunal of any three people. They can be ordinary run-of-the-mill people from the street. Is dayanim lomali? Why does the Mishnah say that these are three dayanim? Throws me off. It gets me confused, and I walk away with the misimpression that I need dayanim. That's not true. We don't need dayanim. Hakamashmalon, dibeina, what we do need, there's a bare minimal requirement of knowledge, and that is bishlosha sheyodim lahakros. What this means is, as we saw in the psukim at the beginning of our discussion tonight, there's what's called kriyas haparsha. There are words and verses that have to be read by the Yevamot. And the halacha is that the tribunal will feed her the words. They will tell her exactly what to say as part of the ritual of chalitza. So the barest minimum knowledge that we require to sit on this tribunal is what's called yodim lahakros. Lahakros means to sort of dictate to her what she should be reciting. And therefore, the Mishnah uses the word dayanim because they are ke'ein dayanim. Ke'ein dayanim means a dayan has knowledge. And in this case, we require that these three people are not judges, they're not musmachim, they're not dayanim technically, but they have a certain yidiyah. And what is that minimum knowledge? The yodim lahakros. Now, there is a recitation of the Yavam, and there's a recitation of the Yevamot. And let's go back to the Psukim again. We're in Paragraph Hey of Sefer Dvarim, and we're looking at Pasuk Ches. In Pasuk Ches, V'omad v'omar, quote, Lo chafatzti lekachta. Those are the three magic words that he has to recite. And in Pasuk Tes, she has to recite the following magic words. Kacha ye'asa le'ish asher lo yivnes beis achiv. We'll see about the next pasuk later on. So these are the recitations of Mikra Chalitza, the words of Chalitza, and that's what the Dayana will be makri there. So it's a little bit ambiguous. The Mishnah uses a word Dayanim, which sort of throws us a little bit off. We don't need Dayanim. But the Mishnah wants to tell us that they at least have to have that bare minimum of knowledge. Now I want to raise another question before we go on. What happens in the case of a Yevama who's not interested in marrying anybody? Maybe she's older, for whatever reason, she lost her husband, and there's no mitzvah of Yibum today, or the Yavam decides back in the day that he doesn't want to be the Yabim her. She's not interested in Chalitza. Do we obligate Chalitza despite the fact that she has no interest in getting remarried? And here we have an insight of the Netziv Mivalojin, the great Rosh Hashiva of Valojin. He's of the opinion that our Mishnah is establishing mitzvahs chalitza, which means an obligation of chalitza. It's irrelevant whether or not she wants to get remarried, even though she declares, I don't need chalitza. Nevertheless, the Bezdin will force the choletz to be mekayim this mitzvah of chalitza, and she will participate, and there's got to be chalitza. Now, 250 years before the Netziv, this question was raised to the Chacham Tzvi, one of the great Ashkenazic poskim from almost 4 centuries ago. And the Chacham Tzvi paskin that there's no need for chalitza unless she wants to get married. And if she's not interested in getting married, then there's no requirement of chalitza. We're not going to bother with the entire process of chalitza, forcing the choletz, the yavam, to come for chalitza if she has no intention of getting remarried. So I want to just throw that out there, because as we go through the parak, if today's experiment will succeed, then we're going to have to come to grips with this machlokas, which seems to be so fundamental between the Chacham Tzvi and the Netziv. Take a look at Tosfos, the first Tosfos in the parak. Hakamashmalin to be inon shlosha edyotos lehakros ke'ein dayonim. Tosfos says, "Aval shar dvorim ain't tzarich shiyu b'kiyim b'hem." We don't require any knowledge other than the ability to be makri these psukim, and we don't take these 3 so-called judges and test them. They don't have to pass any exams. Bechilo asu b'tuv yuchlu lishar lebekiyim. Anyone who's an expert will tell them exactly what they have to know. What they have to know on their own is kriya. Aval kriya imhem lo yadu lehakros lo yuchlu lishar lebekiyim im hikru yofe. We're worried about the case of kriya because there might not be access to bekiyim, to experts, to tell us whether or not they did this properly and they enunciated each word in the proper way. But there are other issues that might come up in chalitza. Those we have to leave to the bekiyim, to the experts. They will decide and rule on the other issues. We go on in the Gemara. Tanina laha de tanarabana. And that phrase means that we have a Mishnah, and the Mishnah is embellished by Tanarabana, by a Brisa. The Mishnah says, Mitzvahs Chalitza Bishlosha. And the Brisa adds, who are these 3 people? Sheyodin lahakros ke'ena dayanim. They are similar to dayanim in the fact that they know how to dictate the psukim to the yavam and to the yavam. But all you need is 3. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamisha. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we're not talking about a bezdin. In fact, there is no halacha 5 on a court. They don't require to be dayanim and judges, but we need 5. We'll have to figure out as we go along why the Tanakama holds in this price that 3 is sufficient. Why does Rabbi Yehuda disagree and require 5? My time of the Tanakama, the Sanya is Canaan. Right, the pasuk in Chalitza says that she shows up in front of Zkanim. Zkanim means 2. Right, the minimum of a plural word in Lashon Kodesh is 2. 9. However, we have a principle that whenever something has to take place that's going to change the halachic status of someone, we need an odd number. There can't be 2 or 4 or 6. There's got to be 3 or 5. There's always got to be an odd number. And that's called Ein Bezdin Shakel. Shakel means when you have an even number that can be split into 2 even numbers, and it becomes a teku, like a stalemate. So we must have in this group of people who are presiding over the Chalitza an odd number. And since it says Kenim, the Tanakama holds, you have to add 1 to 2 and make it 3. And that's called Mosifin, Aleim, Odechad, Arekan, Shlosh. Rabbi Yehuda. What led him to the conclusion that we need 2 times the Kenim, which is 2 times 2, and then add a 5th? It says Ziknei Shnayim and Zkenim Shnayim. Meaning, if the Torah just wanted to tell me that all you need is 2, it should have said Ziknei. So Ziknei is sort of in the word, and that would mean 2, but it says Zkenim, and that's going to jack it up to 2 times Zkenim, which means to 4. The Ein Bezdin Shakel Mosifin Aleim. The Tanakama, Hi Zikne my Ovidle. Right, we go back to the Psukim, and it says the Imlo Yachpotza Ish Lakachas Yivinta, the also Yivinta Shara El Hazkenim. So the Torah uses the words Kenim, and then in the next pasuk it says V'karu lo Ziknei ha'ir. So it's not just the fact that the Torah added the mem to Ziknei, but the fact that it says Kedem and Ziknei twice, that leads Rabbi Yehuda to his conclusion that you need 2 and 2, and to make it tip the scale to make it an odd number, you need a 5th. What did the Chachamim do with the extra word Ziknei? Now the key word here in this phrase is ribuye. Ribuye means an inclusion, right? To be marabe something, marbe something. And in this case, the Tanakama understood that the extra word zikne is coming to be marbe to zikenim, that's sufficient. Now, what's a little bit odd about this Gemara is that usually when we have a ribui, we jack up the numbers. Here, the extra word is coming to diminish the numbers. Instead of interpreting zikne as another 2 to add to the first 2, it's coming to lower it from 4 down to 2. Rabbi Yehuda. How does I'm sorry, I skipped. So, Zikne my Ovidle. Mi boile rebuye afilu shlosha hedyotos. So, the Tanakama says the following. I'm not going to tell you that the word Zikne is going to reduce the number of people that are necessary on this tribunal, because that wouldn't make sense. What I'm telling you is that the word zikne is coming to interpret the word the word Zkanim. So Zkanim means two, but those two maybe perhaps have to be Dayanim. Because usually in the Torah, Zkanim means Dayanim, elders who are experts in the field, they know the Torah, they were tested, they were ordained. But here, the Torah says Zikne, and it's going out of its way to be marbe, something about this Zkanim, that I can view this Zkanim not as Dayanim, but rather as Hedyotos. Hedyotos means regular rank and file members of the community. Rabbi Yehuda, Hedyotos minole. He uses the word Zikne to derive another two members of the court and jack it up to four. He doesn't have the luxury of using Zikne to be Marba Hedyotos. How does Rabbi Yehuda know that these five members of the court are not really Dayanim, and the Hedyotos would suffice? Nafkale mile'ene. So we go back to the pasuk one more time, and if you take a look at pasuk test, it says v'nikcha yevimto elav li'ene hazkenin, in front of the eyes of the zkenin. Why did the Torah have to add the word li'ene hazkenin? The Omar Mar, and he quotes a Rebbe, one of the Amoraim, he doesn't mention it by name. Li'ene prat l'sumin. That the word le'ene is coming to exclude blind people. Blind people cannot be part of this tribunal for chalitza. Now, apparently, we're not talking about dayanim, because blind people cannot serve as dayanim on a regular court. If not for the word li'ene, we would have included blind people. It's therefore if we really need dayanim who could sit on a Sanhedrin, members of a Sanhedrin, why should I exclude sumin? Meaning, why do I need a pasuk li'ene to disqualify sumin if I need Sanhedrin, if I need dayanim? Once you have a summa, he's excluded from playing the role as a dayan. Therefore, I don't need le'ene to exclude it. It must be that hedyotos are okay. And therefore, if not for the word li'ene, I would have validated even blind people, because blind people are no different than hedyotos. They cannot sit as dayanim, but they could be hedyotos. Tani Rav Yosef Nafka. Tani Rav Yosef, Shem shebezdin minukim b'tzedek, kach bezdin minukim mikol mum. Just as a dayan has to be proven to be straight, honest, a man that we can rely on, he would not take a bribe, he's got integrity, he's got a status of what's called minukim, he's clean, he's pure, b'tzedek, with justice. So too, Bezdin has to be minukim, they have to be free of mumin, of permanent blemishes in the body. Very famous story about Rav Moshe Feinstein, that when they wheeled him in for a very serious surgery, his son-in-law, who's a medical doctor, was there. I think he's a medical doctor, I'm not sure. He's definitely a PhD in biology. Anyway, he was there. And Rav Moshe asked him, as they're wheeling him into surgery, will I become a Balmum and I'll be puzzled to sit on the Sanhedrin? Rav Moshe was already imagining that the Sanhedrin would be reestablished at the time of Mashiach. He wanted to know if he comes out of the surgery, will he be able to sit on the Sanhedrin, or he will be a Balmum? If he were a Kohen, he would have asked if he's a Balmum, and therefore he becomes disqualified from doing the Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. But but Moshe was not a Kohen, so he just asked if he's pasul for Sanhedrin. And that psul for Sanhedrin is written here in our Gemara. This is the source from which we learn that a Baal Mum is excluded to serve as a dayan because he's not menukim mikol mum. And therefore, a blind person who has a mum cannot serve as a dayan in Sanhedrin. If you would require dayanim for chalitza, then likewise I would assume, without any need for a pasuk, that a blind person, would be excluded from chalitza. But the answer is, why did the Torah have to go out of its way to disqualify a blind person with the word liene? Because you don't need dayanim. All you need is hedyotos. Now, this brisa of Rav Yosef is now going to address the following question. How do we know that a dayan has to be physically whole without any blemishes? And for that, we want to turn to Daf Kuf Aleph Amid Beis. Shenemar, because the pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, of all places, we're going to use Shir Hashirim to define who is a dayan that qualifies as a dayan. Kulach yafara yasi umum ein bach. Now, it says here that umum ein bach. So the Gemara elsewhere, not here, but in Sanhedrin, says that this pasuk is addressing the question of physical blemishes that disqualify a person from being and serving as a judge. And again, this pasuk is addressing Sanhedrin. It's not addressing the question of chalitza. But if a blind person is invalid for Sanhedrin, then we assume that he's invalid for all adjudication, meaning he cannot adjudicate on any basis. Let's say, for example, Ruvain is a plaintiff and he sues Shimon for damages. A blind person could not serve as a judge to adjudicate this monetary law, even though the pasuk is actually addressing Sanhedrin, and for monetary law we don't need a Sanhedrin, but nevertheless the psulim that disqualify a dayan for Sanhedrin apply even in a monetary case. So again, just to summarize Rabbi Yehuda's logic, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that from the fact that the Torah needed to add the word li'ene, which is otherwise redundant, to exclude, in the case of chalitza, a blind person, it must be that we don't require musmachim, dayanim for chalitza. Otherwise, if we did, we wouldn't need that extra word liene, because by virtue of this pasuk in Shir Hashirim, we would have disqualified a blind person from chalitza. But now that we know that chalitza does not require dayanim, this halacha, this psul of a Baal Mum does not have any application to chalitza. The idach. So the Gemara now, like a ping pong game, the ball is now in the court of the Tanakama. Why do you use the extra word le'ene to teach you, to derive that you don't need dayanim, all you need is hedyotos? I can derive it from the extra word le'ene. Why do I need the word zikne? So the answer is, hahu li'ene, my ovile, what are the chachamim, the Tanakama is going to do with the word li'ene? Hahu likida rava hudiyasa. He needs the word li'ene to derive the halacha, the principle of rava. The Omar Rava, sriche dayane lemechse roka de kanofik bipumid diyava. The Yavama. Right? We said that the Yavam has to spit in front of the Yavam, and those who are presiding, we'll call them Dayanim for lack of a better word. I Mishnah calls them Dayanim, so we're in good company. They have to be able to see the spit. Tichsiv li'ene azkenim v'yarka. So it says li'ene azkenim, and then it says v'yarka, she will spit. These kenim are kenim who could see li'ene azkenim, the spit. A blind person cannot fit this description of li'ene v'yarka. Therefore, he is excluded from being one of the dayanim. So once again, just to reiterate, since the extra word zikne, according to the Chachamim, teaches me that all you need is hedyotos, then ostensibly, a blind person could fit the bill and he could sit on this tribunal. And the answer is no. He cannot sit on this tribunal. And the reason for that is because li'ene yarka, the zikanim have to be able to see the act of when she is yorekes actually. Now, I'm not exactly sure. I'm just sharing with you my confusion. According to Rava, they have to see her spit. What does that mean? Do they have to actually see when she spits? Or is it enough that they see the spit on the ground? I don't know exactly how far you have to go with this. Furthermore, is this absolutely critical? And what happened to the evidence if she spit and they didn't see it? Let's say he closed his eyes or he turned his back the other direction. Is it enough that you have dayanim who are roy l're'im, and that's considered li'ene, or they have to actually see it? V'idach nami b'boile l'kidarova. Rabbi Yehuda should also require the word le'ene to teach me that the dayanim have to actually see the spit, and yet Rabbi Yehuda used the word li'ene to derive the conclusion that even hedyotos are okay. So how would he derive the halacha of Rava requiring the dayanim to see the spit? And the Gemara says, "Einochinami." You're right. The word li'ene is absolutely necessary to require that the dayanim see the spit, and we can't use li'ene to teach us hedyotos. We're going to have to find another source for Rabbi Yehuda from which he will derive lahedyotos. And the answer is nafka mi Yisrael. Well, let's go back again to the psukim. And if we look at Pasuk Yud, it says, V'nikra shmo bi Yisrael. The word Yisrael, argues the Gemara, is there to teach me that any member of Klal Yisrael could be Yisrael. We don't need Zikanim in the sense of Dayanim. So now Rabbi Yehuda has the following. He's got Zikanim and Zikne, from which he derives 4 plus 1 is 5. He needs Li'ene to establish that Rava's halacha, the Dayanim have to see the spit. And now he has the word Yisrael, from which he learns that you can lower the standards. You don't need Dayanim, and any member of Klal Yisrael will do. And that's called in the Gemara's language, Yisrael Koldu. Very interesting phrase. Koldu means like your rank and file layman. Now, it's a little bit strange here because when you read the pasuk, the word Yisrael really is not describing the Dayanim. She is making a proclamation that he is called the Yisrael Beis Chalutz Hanal, that he was only interested in Chalitza. I mean, that's like a grassroots statement on her part, has nothing to do with the Dayanim that are presiding over the Bez. Very, very strange. The Idach. Now we go back to the Chachamim, like the ping pong game, and the ball is in their court. What are they doing with the word Yisrael? Hi Yisrael, my Ovidle. The Bach has a girsa, Hi be Yisrael, my Ovidle. Mi boile lichedetani Rab Shmuel bar Yehuda. So we have a brisa from Rab Yehuda, Rab Shmuel bar Yehuda. Be Yisrael, be Bezdin shall Yisrael, v'lo be Bezdin shall Gerin. Again, we haven't learned the sugyas about the status of Gerim to serve on a court, even for monetary cases. And that's going to be a sugya later on. And the Gemara is going to decide that a ger is disqualified for the tribunal of Chalitza, and he cannot preside over the Chalitza. So if you ever get called in for Chalitza, they're going to ask you if you're a ger. The Idach. Now Rabbi Yehuda has to find a pasuk because he uses Yisrael to teach us that Hedyotos. He needs a pasuk to exclude Gerim. And the Gemara says, "Be Yisrael achrina ksiv." Okay, now in order to appreciate this, once again we have to go back to the Chumash. So in pasuk Yud, it says, "V'nikra shmo be Yisrael." Correct? So what is Rabbi Yehuda's point over here? Does Rabbi Yehuda have the word Yisrael twice in this parsha? Offhand, I don't see it once. So what does he mean, be Yisrael achrina ksiv? Where is that? So if you take a look, it says, "V'nikra shmo be Yisrael beis chalutz hanal." What's Rabbi Yehuda talking about? The Pella. The Yisrael achrina ksiv. So Abosai, it seems to me that we have to go back to pasuk Zayin, which is the opening pasuk that we read tonight in this parsha. And it says the following: the Omra, she declares in front of this Canaan, Me'ein Yevami lahakim liachim shem be Yisrael. And then if you fast forward to pasuk Yud, the Nikra Shmo be Yisrael. So the Torah has be Yisrael both at the beginning of this parsha and at the end of the parsha. And Rabbi Yehuda says that one be Yisrael is going to tell me that it's okay to have a bezin of Hidyotos. And then the other be Yisrael is going to tell me that we exclude and disqualify Gerin. So the Gemara asks V'idach, and what about the Tanakama? Why does he need two be Yisraels? Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Pama achas hayinu yoshvim lifnei Rabbi Tarfon, uba Yevamot lachlots, vi Omar lanu anu kulchem chalutz hanal. So there's a halacha here which Rabbi Shmuel derives from the pasuk that requires aniyah, those who preside over the court for the chalitza should recite or declare chalutz hanal. A new halacha here, chalutz hanal. So now the Tanakama needs two Yisraels, one to exclude Gerim and the other to require that the Dayanim, at the conclusion of the process of Chalitza, they are required to announce Chalutz Hanal. Ve'idach, how does Rabbi Yehuda derive this requirement that the Dayanim pronounce and declare Chalutz Hanal? Mi v'nikra nafka. Now, how exactly does Rabbi Yehuda see in the word v'nikra this halacha of chalutz hanal? So we're going to have to stop now because it's late, but this is where we're going to start in Mitzvah Shem next week. We already got a good taste and an introduction to chalitza. So if it's okay with the Olam, we're going to continue next week. So I'll take this opportunity to wish everyone a great remainder of the week and a great Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh Av, and Parshas Matos and Mas. Thank you very much.